Hey everyone, my name is MrWalla, and this is going to be a build guide on my Bladefall Blade Blast Elementalist that I've been playing as my league starter for 3.13. I've played a lot of Blade Blast in the past couple leagues, so when I saw the changes that were coming to Elementalist for 3.13, I thought this would be a pretty good Ascendancy for it. The AoE and clear for this build feel really nice, and the single target damage is also pretty damn good. It functions pretty well on budget gear as you come to expect from most league starters, but with Harvest Crafts you can easily push this build even farther. This has probably been one of my favorite all-around builds in a long time, so I'm super excited to be making this guide, as I've wanted to make another one ever since my first Elementalist guide last year. So let's get started. So let's start out by talking what main skills we're using and how we're using them. If you've never played Bladefall Blade Blast or don't know how it works, casting Blade Blast will create a small physical explosion on the ground, pretty underwhelming by itself. However, if you cast Bladefall on the ground first, it will place blades down on the ground that the Blade Blast can then detonate when cast. Using both Spell Cascade and Unleash support gems with our Bladefall allows us to maximize the amount of blades that we put down to be detonated. Besides the obvious damage increases we want for scaling Blade Blast's damage, we also want to scale Blade Blast's AoE higher and Blade Fall's AoE lower, in order for a more concentrated area of blades we put on the ground, and for more overlap for our Blade Blast explosions. Obviously, we still want AoE for clear, but doing this is really huge for single target damage. Besides Bladefall and Blade Blast, this build also utilizes the new Hydrosphere skill, to apply both lightning and cold exposure to enemies, which is then amplified with the reworked Mastermind of Discord Ascendancy node. When scaling this build, since we are Elementalist and scale a ton of elemental damage with things like Elemental Overload and Heart of Destruction, 100% physical to elemental conversion is a must. Thankfully, this is super easy using Hrim Sorrows as well as physical to lightning support. Speaking of Elemental Overload, this means we are not going to be scaling critical strikes. I think this build could be crit with a lot of investment on the tree and with gear, but I much prefer the non-crit version, as we already do plenty of damage, and most likely you're going to be sacrificing survivability when investing into crit, so I don't really think it's worth it in my opinion. So before I get into each piece of gear, I want to mention that this build is pretty league starter and solo self-found friendly, which means most gear early on can just be simple gear with life and resist, as most of our damage will be carried by our Ascendancy, gems, and weapons. Then once you start getting later into the game, you will want to acquire some more specific gear, which I did mostly through harvest crafting. It's also worth mentioning that I'm playing this build in a private league with a few friends, so almost all of my gear is self-found and harvest crafted. Starting off with our weapons, we are going to be dual wielding either scepters or wands. I decided to use scepters. Here's a list of good mods to look for on them. Increased spell damage, cold or lightning damage, flat added cold to spells, flat added lightning to spells, increased cast speed, physical is extra cold from Redeemer influence, Fizz is extra lightning from Crusader influence, and then most importantly, +1 level of all physical spell skill gems or +1 level of all spell skills. The +1 level mods for our Blade Blast should be priority number 1 if you can get it, since giving more levels to your spells is always a ton of damage. Also, just a fair warning with these two +1 mods, these are the only ones that will level up your Blade Blast. Even though we are doing cold and lightning damage, Blade Blast is a physical spell skill, not a cold or lightning skill. So +1 level of cold or lightning skill gems will not work on Blade Blast. For one of your weapons, something really important for the build is having an open suffix to craft trigger-socketed spells when you use a skill, in order to cast our Hydrosphere automatically while casting our main damage. For gloves, we're going to be using Hrim Sorrows to convert 50% of our physical damage to cold. As I said before, this is super important since we want our physical damage to scale with elemental. Unlike most gear, especially because I am group self-found, I really don't see myself switching off of these as I'm still using them 2 weeks in. However, if you have the resources available to you, you could also opt to use something like a Hatred Watcher's Eye with cold conversion and a pair of rare gloves with cold conversion crafted on them. With your chest piece, early on, a rare with as much life as you can get is best. Look out for the flat life, percent life, hybrid incursion mod if you can get one, as rituals will often give you gear with incursion mods as well as 5 links and 6 links that you can slap an Essence of Greed onto. Another chest that I used for a bit early on is Carcass Check. I wouldn't stick with this for too long though. The AoE you get from it is nice for clearing, but the AoE it gives to Bladefall is worse for single target. So I think Carcass is fine to use early on if you have one, but the AoE isn't necessary and I'd much prefer a chest with lots of life and resist over it. Later on, you will want a chest piece with the Crusader Explosion mod. Even though this mod is pretty rare, these are actually extremely easy to make with Harvest once you get an item level 85 or higher Crusader influence base. I'll go into a step-by-step process on how to harvest craft one of these later into the video. Alternatively, Impulses would also be a nice option that works similarly to an Explodey chest, but overall I think a rare chest with the Explosion mod is best in slot. Moving on to our rings, for your first slot I recommend a Barracks Grip. A really crucial part of the build is getting a source of life leech for sustain, and since we are using the Shaper of Storm's Ascendancy node to shock with all of our hits, Barracks Grip gives us free life leech as well as some life and damage. After that, there are some other ways to get leech, such as cold or lightning damage leech on your amulet, or a cluster jewel with the Doriani's Lesson. So if you get one of these sources instead, you could opt to switch out Barracks Grip for another rare ring with life. For the second ring, starting off, I used a ring with life and resist as well as dexterity. You're going to need at least 159 dexterity for your character to use a level 21 Blade Blast, so rings as well as boots, helm, and amulet can have the dexterity you need. Later on, you'll want to get yourself a ring with Elemental Weakness Curse on hit to lower enemies' elemental resist for a big boost in damage. Spamming caster reforges in the Harvest are a good way to get a decent ring with this mod. For your amulet, you'll most likely want to use a base that has dex in the implicit. As I mentioned before, you will need at least 159. For the stats, I just used a rare with life, spell damage, and some resists until I got a Shaper base to craft on for Fizz's Extra Lightning or Fizz's Extra Cold, or both if you can get it. Using physical reforges in Harvest after qualitying your amulet with Turbulent Catalysts is a pretty easy way to craft something decent with either of these mods. For your Anointment, a pretty good option is Ash, Frost, and Storm. This gives us some damage, some shock and chill effect, and even some reduced shock and chill effect on us. Helmet is pretty straightforward. Life, res, attributes, and if you can, I recommend trying to get any amount of physical taken as cold, lightning, or fire damage. This is a really good defensive mod for Elementalist as it pairs well with the Bastion of Elements Ascendancy node, because a portion of the physical hits you will take will be mitigated by the Primal Aegis shield. The Helm enchant isn't too necessary, but either Blade Blast area effect or Blade Blast damage if you can get it would be good. For boots, there's nothing really fancy to be done with the mods, just a basic pair with resists, life, and movement speed are good. However, something I highly recommend you get on them is the increased mana regeneration if you've cast a spell recently in enchant. This, along with a few other things, is going to be huge for sustaining your mana while you're spamming Bladefall and Blade Blast, so that you can drop your mana flask for a more useful one. Belt is also pretty straightforward early on, life and resists, and using a Stygian Vice for the base if possible for the extra Abyss Jewel slot. Later on, you can get some nice damage mods from influences. The ones I decided to craft were cast speed during any flask effect and spell damage during any flask effect, both from Shaper influence. Throwing some caster reforges from Harvest on a Shaper belt is a good way to get at least one of these, even both if you're lucky. Moving on to flasks, here's the current setup that I'm using. An instant life flask with bleed immunity, a quartz flask for phasing with duration and curse immunity, a quicksilver flask with alchemist and adrenaline for lots of movement speed, a granite flask with duration and freeze immunity, and this is the flask that I swapped out my mana flask for once I got enough regen. So if you don't have enough mana regeneration, use an enduring mana flask instead. For the last flask, you have a couple of unique options. Anziri's Promise is a ton of extra chaos damage, as well as some leech and chaos resist if you aren't kept. Wise Oak will require you to balance both your cold and your lightning resist, but is a lot of damage. And the third option, which I think is the best choice out of all three, is Taste of Fate, providing both damage and a lot of survivability with the physical taken as cold damage mod. For jewels, I'm using a couple different ones. First, I have a Searching Eye Abyss Jewel with life and chance to gain Onslaught on kill. Onslaught gives us movement speed and cast speed, which is really nice for clearing. Then, I'm using a Thread of Hope with medium range. This is a unique jewel drop from Awakener that allows us to allocate points within a ring without them being connected to your tree. I use it on this jewel socket here on the Templar side to grab Divine, Wrath, Judgment, and Fury without having to get travel nodes, saving us 5 passive points. For any other jewels, I prefer Hypnotic jewels with life and flat physical damage to spells, or flat physical damage to spells while dual wielding, but you can also use normal jewels with percent life and damage mods like area damage or global fizz damage. I also highly recommend getting a Corrupted Blood immunity jewel if possible, maybe shooting for at least one useful mod like life on it. For my cluster jewels, I'm currently using 2 small, 2 passive life jewels with Fettle for a ton of extra life. Both of these are socketed into a large 8 passive cold cluster jewel with Inspire Depression and Doriani's Lesson. Inspire Depression gives us a lot of mana regen when we freeze or shock enemies, as well as shock effect for damage. And like I mentioned before, Doriani's lesson provides us with another source of life leech so that you can drop Barrack Script for another ring. Moving on to our gem links, for your main Blade Blast setup we are using Blade Blast, Physical Delightening, Hypothermia, Controlled Destruction, Inspiration, and Intensify. This is in order of link priority as well, so if you only have a 5 link, you will drop Intensify. Also, make sure you're using the highest level Blade Blast you can get your hands on. A mistake a lot of people will make, especially in Trade League, is not using a level 20 or 21 spell. Like I mentioned before, levels on a spell are a huge amount of damage, so the difference between a lower level Blade Blast and a max level Blade Blast is night and day. Socketed in the helm, I have Bladefall, Concentrated Effect, Unleash, and level 2 Spell Cascade. The reason we don't level Spell Cascade past level 2 is because starting at level 3, Spell Cascade will give us more and more area of effect to our Bladefall, and remember, we want the smallest area of effect possible on Bladefall. In our weapon with the Triggercraft we have Hydrosphere, Frostbomb, supported by increased critical strikes to help us keep our elemental overload up more frequently. In the other weapon we have our Cast on Damage Taken setup. Level 2 Cast on Damage Taken, level 11 Steel Skin, and increased duration. In the gloves is our Auras and Val skill. Hatred, Herald of Ice, level 1 Clarity, and Val Righteous Fire. Make sure you aren't leveling up your Clarity since unlike the other two auras, Clarity will reserve more and more mana each level. Lastly in our boots is our movement skills. Flame Dash, level 7 Arcane Surge, Second Wind, and Smoke Mine. Smoke Mine is honestly a big personal preference. I really like the feel of smoke mining into Flame Dash, but if you don't care for it, then you can just swap it out for faster casting or even Culling Strike for finishing off bosses. Moving on to our Ascendancy tree, the first node we take is Mastermind of Discord. I talked about this earlier, but this node goes super well with Hydrosphere, adding an additional -25 to enemies' cold and lightning resists, on top of the -10 Hydrosphere already inflicts, and also gives us some mana regen, which is always nice. After that, we take Heart of Destruction. This gives a huge amount of AoE when clearing, and gives us Convergence when killing bosses. You can kinda treat Convergence as a lesser elemental overload, giving us 30% more elemental damage that's up half the time when killing bosses. The next point we take is Bastion of Elements. This node gives us a permanent level 20 Primal Aegis. Primal Aegis is a shield that absorbs incoming elemental damage from hits. This shield kind of works similarly to Energy Shield in that if the shield is damaged, it will recharge if it doesn't absorb any more damage in the next 5 seconds. However, if the shield gets broken and goes down to 0, its recharge won't be interrupted regardless of you taking any more elemental hits. The amount of damage the Primal Aegis can absorb is determined by the total amount of notables you have allocated throughout your entire skill tree. Notables being the medium-sized nodes on your tree. So since I have a total of 39 notables that I took in my tree, my Primal Aegis can absorb 3,900 damage from elemental hits. In addition to the Primal Aegis shield, Bastion of Elements also provides us with Elemental Reflect immunity. A fair warning, however, even though our Blade Blast is all elemental damage, our Blade Fall is still half physical, and we only get Elemental Reflect immunity, not physical. So take a page out of Zizaran's book, and don't kill yourself to a Reflect map. Of course, if you want to run a physical Reflect map, you can swap Conk Effect out for Physical Delightening. And for our last node, we're taking Shaper of Storms. This one is pretty straightforward. It lets us shock with all of our hits to do a ton more damage. Unfortunately, we don't get anything out of the last line in the node as we are doing more cold damage than lightning, but even without it, this node is still really nice. For Pantheons, I use Soul of Lunaris and Soul of Gurukhan, and for Bandits, kill all for the 2 extra passive points. For the passive tree, I'll link a Path of Building pastebin down in the description for you to follow. If you've never heard of or used Path of Building, this is a really helpful program for planning out and following builds that I think every PoE player should have, so I'll include the link to the download for that as well. Once you have that downloaded, to import builds with the pastebin link, first copy the link, go to import/export build, click on import from pastebin, then paste the link, hit import, and then finally hit import again. You should now be able to see the start of the passive tree. If you go to the bottom left, you'll see a drop-down menu. Click that, and you'll be able to scroll through each state of the skill tree and the pathing I took as I leveled. For leveling, I leveled with Stormblast Mine and Aura Storms until level 28. Make sure to craft yourself some lightning damage wands starting at level 8. You can make these by selling any magic wand, a topaz ring, and an orb of alteration to a vendor. There are 3 tiers of this recipe, giving more lightning damage each tier. One at level 8, one at level 14, and one at level 20. each tier depending on the rarity of topaz ring sold to the vendor. Then once you get to the library in Act 3 around level 28, you can pick up Bladefall from Syosa after doing his quest, and Blade Blast from Yina in Act 2. So for the last part of the guide, I want to show you how you can make an explodey chest really easy with harvest crafts. First, let's take a look at PoE database to see why it's so easy to get such a rare mod. Here's the mod that we want on the chest piece. As you can see, it has the physical tag on it. There are only 2 other mods possible on a Crusader chest piece that have the same physical tag. Physical hits taken as lightning damage, and reflect physical damage to melee attackers. This means that there are a total of 3 physical mods that you can have on an item level 85 or higher Crusader chest piece. So, what we can do is use Jagged Fossils or Physical Reforges until you get both the Physical Reflect and the Physical Taken as Lightning Damage mods on the chest with no other prefixes. Now, if we use an Augment Physical modifier from Harvest, since we already have 2 of the 3 physical mods possible on the chest, it has no other choice but to give us the Explosion mod. After we have all 3 mods on the chest piece, we can then use a Remove Physical modifier, where one of 3 things will happen. First, if you hit the Explosion mod, rinse and repeat. Use another Augment Physical and try again. If you hit the Physical Taken as Lightning, you can either craft life and use the chest as it is, which is a great idea starting out, or use another Remove Physical for a 50-50 chance at removing the Reflect mod. Obviously, this is riskier. And lastly, if you hit the Physical Reflect, you can now use a Remove Lightning to get rid of the Physical Taken as Lightning, or do what I did and just keep it, since this mod is already very good for us. And that's going to wrap it up for this guide. I hope you all enjoyed it. This build has been a ton of fun for me in the last couple weeks, so this video was a lot of fun to make. As always, if you have any questions about the build or Path of Exile in general, or just want to chat, feel free to stop by my stream at twitch.tv/MrWalla. Thanks again everyone, and have a fantastic day.